You ever have that kind of morning or that kind of day, I guess, where you wake up a bit hungover, but it's so gorgeous outside to get all in perspective? Yeah, I guess that's what I'm doing today.
Hey y'all, I'm Lucas Twyman, and I'm the Angels Envy Whiskey Guardian for Toronto, Ontario, Canada. That means I'm your new ambassador to all things Angels Envy up here. I'm pretty excited to talk to you today about Angels Envy Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, finished in port wine barrels. Quite a mouthful there, but all those words actually mean something important, and that's what we're going to talk about for a little bit. I often get people asking me the question, hey, what's the difference between bourbon and whiskey? Sometimes people are a bit ruder about it. They'll go, oh, I'm a whiskey drinker, but I hate bourbon. Or, I love bourbon, but I don't like whiskey. The truth of the matter is, bourbon is whiskey. It's just a very specific kind of whiskey. It's whiskey that initially, rules wise, most importantly, is made in the United States. Now, it doesn't have to be made in Kentucky. Kentuckians just usually do it the best. Now, there are a few other rules when it comes to American whiskey, and particularly bourbon. So let's talk a little bit about what whiskey is. So whiskey, what you do is you take a bunch of grains and you blend them together, and you make essentially a beer. When I talk about beer, I'm talking about beer like almost what it was like when it was first invented back in 10,000 BC. It's just a big bunch of grains that have been put together and fermented. Now, bourbon itself needs to be at least 51% corn in those initial blend of grains. So it's a blend of multiple grains. So at least half corn, and then usually either some rye or wheat, although some folks have been experimenting with having both. And then almost always a little bit of barley, and that barley is malted. And when I say malted, I mean it's the same thing that you put into beer. The barley started germinating to turn some of those complex starches into sugars. And then you got your yeast in there, and it eats up those sugars and it makes alcohol. Basically, it makes a beer. And from there, we distill it. And that's the next important part, and the next set of rules. So, American whiskey, particularly bourbon, can't be more than 80% ethanol off the still. So that means you can't distill out all of kind of the flavors and essential elements of those grains when you are making American whiskey. It then, after it comes off the still, needs to be put in a barrel. And this is one of the most unique things about bourbon, or straight whiskeys in general. That barrel needs to be new American oak, and a wonderful coincidence that actually really helps the character of American straight bourbon. Because it means that all that wood, I got some right around here, the wood from the staves of the barrel, it's going to be the first time anything's extracted out of it, is when we put that whiskey into the barrel. So that means all those powerful flavor compounds are still present, and we're drawing them into the whiskey itself. And it doesn't actually take all that long for that process to go. After a while, it's more about mellowing things out. But like I said, new oak cask has to go in there at least 62.5%, and then after it's aged in there for a while, you can put it into your bottles. And in your bottles, it has to be at least 40% ABV. Now, down in the States, they call it proof. Proof is double the ABV, so it'd be 80 proof. Angel's Envy is at 43.3% proof. Or, sorry, ABV. 43.3% ABV, which gives a little bit more body than kind of the lowest end it could be, but still makes it really nice and smooth and approachable. So, the other rule about bourbon is aging. And there's a lot of talk about American whiskey, right? Like, if you just call it bourbon, you can age it for a very small amount of time, although you do have to list that. This is where another word that's on this bottle matters a lot. Straight. So, straight bourbon whiskey needs to be aged for a minimum of 2 years. And if you don't have the age statement on there, it's going to be a minimum of 4 years. So most Angel's Envy whiskey, we don't have an age statement on there. It's going to be between 4 and 6 years old, which is kind of one of the sweet spots for American whiskey, particularly the style that we're putting out. And then we've got kind of the next line on there. Finished in port wine barrels. And that's where things get a little bit interesting. So, when Angel's Envy first came out, I'd already been living up in Canada. My dad I got him into collecting whiskey. It was a nice way we kind of reconnected. When I was younger, I wouldn't say I was any real angel. So it was nice to have a reason to talk to my family again. And that's kind of why I got into bourbon in the first place. I left Kentucky. Kentucky's a traditional place. Not all the traditions kind of were that great for me. So I left, but bourbon was a way to hold on. And when Angels first came out, it was pretty controversial, that port finish, right? Doesn't fit the rules for bourbon for necessarily. So people were in uproar. It's weird to say that, but they were. But you had Lincoln Henderson, right? Like, his name's on the bottle there, Lincoln Henderson. He'd been working in whiskey for almost 40 years. He worked for Brown-Forman. He invented some of the biggest whiskey brands in the world. And then when he decided he wanted to do something with his family, son approached him. He wanted to do something new. Wanted to bend that tradition a little bit, I think. I don't want to put words in the mouth of a man who's no longer with us, but I think maybe he wanted to try something different to push things forward, and that's pretty exciting. He was bending those traditions, breaking those rules, as a man who was tradition, right? Not to get all highfalutin, but Milton said his Lucifer is a character I think about sometimes in Paradise Lost, and he said he'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. And that's what angels are, right? We get the name of Angel's Envy from the angel's share, the evaporation. There's like 5% evaporation in a barrel every year. That's lost. And that's the angel share. So the idea was Angel's Envy is so good that the angels will be envious that we have it left. But I like to kind of think of it in another way. Angels have to follow rules, or they stop being angels. They're envious of what we have here. Let's talk about those port wine casks. Lincoln Henderson had retired after 39 years in the whiskey business. He was in the first Bourbon Hall of Fame entry. He was a legend. So when his son approached him and he wanted to start a new whiskey company with him, he wanted to do something unique, something different that hadn't really been done. So that brings us to the port wine finish. So as we've established, bourbon must be finished in new oak. What we do is we take it, we batch it, and then we age it in ruby port barrels from a bunch of different producers around Portugal. And after just 6 months, there's a lot of diffusion that goes on, and it does a great job of kind of absorbing some of those flavors, giving it kind of a richness, a kind of black fruit element, as well as a nice sweetness. So it ends up working out really well, and it's also something really unique to the market. In the US, we also have rum finishes in our yearly special releases, but this is what we have up here now in Canada, and I'm really excited to share it with everybody. One of the things I think about a lot is how unexpected my life is, but still how good it is. There's no realm where I could have predicted I would have ended up in Canada, but my life is good. I've got a family, people who love me, pretty good job. But it wasn't from doing, I think, what I was supposed to do. It wasn't from doing what was supposed to be traditional. I didn't follow those traditions completely. I did what was right. I did what was traditionally right in my life, the way I behaved, but I then made unexpected choices at the end, and it's led me here. And without sounding too cheesy, it's probably why I like Angel's Envy, because it does it too.